You speak for your communities, representing an incredible richness of cultures, languages, and perspectives. We owe it to this generation and those who succeed us to think and act for the greater good of all.
King Charles just made a move so ruthless, so calculated, that Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie never saw it coming. Their own uncle, the king himself, held their futures hostage to destroy their father. What happened next behind palace walls will shock you, because this wasn't just about titles anymore. This was about family turning on family, about two innocent women becoming pawns in the most brutal royal power play in modern history. And when Prince William takes the throne, everything gets worse.
These are great assets and great tools for young people. So I really see the work that we're doing, raising awareness around dyslexia, as a true pillar to stand up the concept of reimagining education. Because so many young people now are going to be faced with some of the biggest moral and ethical decisions.
The British royal family has always been an institution built on tradition, titles, and carefully maintained public image. But behind the gilded gates of Windsor, a high-stakes negotiation was unfolding that would test the very foundations of modern monarchy. At the center of this royal chess game were two young women who never asked to be pawns in their father's downfall: Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, the daughters of the now disgraced Prince Andrew. For months, the different standoff at Royal Lodge had become an embarrassment that King Charles could no longer ignore. His younger brother Andrew, stripped of his working royal duties back in 2019 following that catastrophic interview about his friendship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, had been clinging to his 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate like a barnacle to a ship. The former Duke of York believed he was untouchable, protected by what he thought was an ironclad lease agreement that would allow him to remain in the property until 2078. He had no intention of leaving, and frankly, why would he? The sprawling Royal Lodge, with its manicured gardens and palatial rooms, was one of the last vestiges of the life he once led as a senior working royal. But this wasn't just about a stubborn brother refusing to downsize. This was about the future of the monarchy itself. King Charles had spent years, even before ascending to the throne, talking about his vision for a slimmed-down monarchy. He wanted an institution that reflected modern Britain, one that was more efficient, more accountable, and crucially, one that didn't hemorrhage money supporting extended family members who no longer contributed to the royal cause. The image of a bloated royal household, with distant relatives living rent-free in grace and favor properties while the country struggled with a cost of living crisis, was exactly the kind of optics that could damage the crown's standing with the public. And then there was Prince William, the heir to the throne, watching all of this unfold with growing frustration. William had his own ideas about the future, reportedly favoring an even more streamlined European-style monarchy, similar to what the Dutch or Swedish royal families had implemented. He didn't work before 10 in the morning, stopped by 4 in the evening, and took very few trips abroad. His approach was decidedly different from the old guard, and he certainly had no patience for the scandal that his uncle continued to drag through the press. The problem was that Andrew wasn't budging. Every attempt to negotiate, every suggestion of alternative accommodation, every plea from the king himself seemed to bounce off the walls of Royal Lodge without effect. Charles needed leverage, something that would finally force his brother's hand. And that's when attention turned to Andrew's two daughters. Princess Beatrice, 37 years old, and Princess Eugenie, 35, had spent their entire lives navigating the peculiar space between being royal and being, well, normal. Unlike their cousins William and Harry, they weren't working royals. They received no money from the sovereign grant. They had to earn their own living, with Beatrice working as vice president of partnerships and strategy at a software company called Affinity, and Eugenie as a director at the prestigious Hauser & Wirth Art Gallery in London. Yet they still carried the title of princess, still had the His Royal Highness styling before their names, and still attended major royal events like Trooping the Colour and Christmas at Sandringham. It was an awkward position, made infinitely more complicated by their father's spectacular fall from grace. They had been young adults when Jeffrey Epstein first became a household name in connection with their father. Beatrice had been just 18 when Epstein, along with Ghislaine Maxwell and Harvey Weinstein, were reportedly hosted at Royal Lodge before her masked ball birthday celebrations at Windsor Castle in 2006. The sisters had done nothing wrong themselves, had never been accused of any wrongdoing, and yet the stain of their father's associations followed them everywhere. Royal watchers had long debated what should happen with Beatrice and Eugenie. Some argued they should be brought in as working royals, especially as the number of active senior royals dwindled following Harry and Meghan's departure to California, and with both King Charles and Princess Catherine facing their own health challenges. There had been talk of the B team, as one tabloid dubbed it, a chance for Beatrice, in particular, to step up and shine during a time when the monarchy desperately needed some glamour and additional hands on deck. Others, however, felt that their connection to Andrew made them a liability, that bringing them further into the fold would only serve to remind the public of scandals the palace was desperately trying to move past. But there was something that both King Charles and Prince William understood very clearly. Andrew loved his daughters. It was perhaps the one redeeming quality that remained in a man whose reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed. He was a father who wanted the best for his girls, who wanted them to maintain their status, their place in royal life, and their future prospects. And that paternal love, that fierce protectiveness, was the one pressure point that might actually work. According to senior royal sources who were briefed on the negotiations, King Charles and Prince William began to lean on this exact vulnerability. The message that filtered down to Andrew through back channels was subtle but unmistakable. His daughters' futures, their titles, their positions within the royal family, their ability to continue attending events and maintaining their royal roles, all of this was suddenly very much part of the discussion about Royal Lodge. It wasn't presented as a harsh ultimatum, at least not officially. The language was polite, diplomatic even, but the implication was crystal clear. Beatrice and Eugenie would be protected, their status would remain intact, but only if Andrew finally stood down. One senior source put it bluntly, noting that the signal couldn't have been clearer. The titles, the positions, and the future roles of both princesses were directly tied to what Andrew decided to do next. Another insider tried to soften it slightly, saying it wasn't technically an ultimatum, but admitted that the meaning was impossible to ignore. It was, in essence, a bribe wrapped in the most polite royal language imaginable. Had Andrew continued to dig his heels in? Had he continued to refuse every reasonable offer, then King Charles and Prince William would have been forced to look at broader changes that would directly impact his daughters. For the king, this was about more than just evicting a difficult brother from an expensive property. This was about establishing moral certainty and credibility at a time when the royal family desperately needed both. While Andrew sulked in Royal Lodge, people like Prince William, Princess Catherine, Princess Anne, and the king himself were working tirelessly to maintain the institution's relevance and public support. The contrast couldn't have been starker, and Charles knew that every day Andrew remained in that mansion, refusing to face the consequences of his poor judgment, was another day the monarchy looked weak, out of touch. The pressure on Andrew was immense, but so too was the pressure on Beatrice and Eugenie. They found themselves caught between loyalty to their father and the harsh reality that his presence, his stubbornness, and his continued association with one of the darkest scandals in modern royal history was threatening their own futures. These were women who had built careers, who had married, who had started families of their own. They had spent years trying to carve out identities separate from the chaos that surrounded their parents. And now, through no fault of their own, their royal status had become a bargaining chip in a family negotiation that was playing out on the world stage. The negotiation that unfolded behind palace walls was nothing short of extraordinary. It represented a calculated gamble by King Charles, one that required him to walk an incredibly fine line between protecting his nieces and removing his brother from a situation that had become untenable for the monarchy. The stakes could not have been higher, and the method Charles chose to employ would set a precedent for how the modern royal family handles internal crises. What made this situation particularly delicate was that Charles genuinely cared about Beatrice and Eugenie. Multiple sources close to the king confirmed that he had great affection for both young women and felt deeply responsible for them during what was described as a hideous time for the family. The king understood that his nieces were innocent bystanders in their father's scandal, and he had no desire to punish them for mistakes they didn't make. This was one of the rare points, insiders noted, where King Charles and Prince Andrew actually saw eye to eye. Both men cared deeply about the princesses and believed they could make meaningful contributions to public life. But caring about his nieces didn't mean Charles was willing to let Andrew continue as he had been. The situation at Royal Lodge had dragged on for far too long, becoming a source of international embarrassment. Every headline about Andrew refusing to leave, every story about the king's inability to shift his stubborn brother, chipped away at the authority and dignity of the crown. Charles had promised a slimmed-down monarchy, and here was his own brother, occupying a mansion that reportedly required massive upkeep costs, contributing nothing to the institution and bringing nothing but negative attention. Prince William's involvement in the strategy added another layer of complexity. The heir to the throne had his own vision for the future, and it was even more streamlined than his father's. William was preparing for his eventual role as king, and from his perspective, Andrew's continued presence anywhere near the center of royal life was simply unacceptable. The younger generation of royals, William and Catherine in particular, represented everything the monarchy needed to be: modern, relatable, hardworking, and scandal-free. Andrew represented the opposite, a relic of an older, more entitled era, when royals could behave badly and expect to be shielded from consequences. Together, Charles and William crafted what can only be described as a sophisticated piece of leverage. The understanding that was communicated to Andrew through intermediaries was carefully constructed. Beatrice and Eugenie would retain their princess titles. They would keep their current positions in the line of succession, with Beatrice 9th and Eugenie 12th. They would continue to be considered eligible for future public roles, should the monarchy need them. Most significantly, Beatrice would remain a Councillor of State, a position that allowed her to act on behalf of the king should he be unavailable or incapacitated. These were substantial assurances, and they addressed Andrew's deepest fears about his daughters losing their royal standing. For Andrew, the message was clear. Safeguarding his daughters was the red line he couldn't cross. Once he received assurances that Beatrice and Eugenie's positions would remain intact, he finally agreed to step aside. The former Duke of York, who had resisted every previous attempt to move him, suddenly found himself willing to negotiate. It wasn't his own loss of status that moved him. It wasn't the financial arguments or the public relations disaster. It was the implicit threat to his daughters' futures that finally broke through his defenses. The timing of what happened next was telling. Shortly after Andrew accepted the loss of his titles and agreed to leave Royal Lodge, Outward Bound, an organization with long-standing ties to the royal family, announced Princess Beatrice as its new deputy patron. Her uncle, Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, was confirmed as patron. To those watching closely, this looked like the palace making good on its promise. Beatrice was being given a meaningful role, a way to contribute to royal life and build her own public profile separate from her father's shadow. It was a signal that the deal had been honored, that the king was indeed protecting his nieces as promised. Princess Eugenie also saw an uptick in her royal visibility. She was announced as a mentor for the King's Foundation's 35 Under 35 initiative, a program close to Charles's heart. At an event in London, Eugenie spent time with young people, offering guidance and support. One ceramicist who attended the mentoring session described it as lovely to spend time with the princess, adding that getting her support on working with galleries would be invaluable. These weren't coincidences. This was the palace demonstrating that Beatrice and Eugenie still had a place, still had value, and still had futures within the broader royal ecosystem. But the back-channel compromise came with its own complications. By giving Beatrice and Eugenie increased visibility and new patronages, Charles was walking a tightrope. On one hand, he was keeping his word to protect them and demonstrate that they shouldn't be punished for their father's sins. On the other hand, every public appearance the sisters made risked reminding people of the Epstein scandal. Critics who viewed the princesses as too closely tied to their father's controversies weren't going to simply forget because the women were attending charity events. The associations ran deep, including the fact that Andrew had invited Epstein to Beatrice's 18th birthday party, and that both sisters had been entangled in questions over payments from a Turkish businesswoman to the family. Some royal commentators argued that the increased visibility was actually part of a larger strategy to rehabilitate the York sisters' images. By associating them with serious charitable work, with the king's own initiatives, And with respectable organizations, the palace was attempting to slowly shift public perception. They were betting that over time, people would start to see Beatrice and Eugenie as individuals in their own right, rather than simply as Andrew's daughters. It was a long game, one that required patience and careful management. Yet the intensity of the pressure on the monarchy to distance itself from Andrew couldn't be understated. The Epstein scandal wasn't going away. Virginia Giuffre's allegations, Andrew's disastrous interview attempts, the settlement he reached without admitting guilt, all of it remained in the public consciousness. Every time Andrew's name appeared in the news, it damaged the institution. And every time Beatrice and Eugenie appeared at a royal event, particularly if they were photographed with their father, it created an uncomfortable reminder of connections the palace desperately wanted to sever. The political reality was that Charles and William needed Andrew gone from any position of influence or visibility. Royal Lodge was symbolic of everything wrong with the old system. Here was a man who had brought disgrace upon the family, living in luxury at what appeared to be the crown's expense, while contributing absolutely nothing positive in return. The optics were dreadful. British taxpayers, struggling with inflation and economic uncertainty, were asked to look past the fact that a disgraced prince was living in a mansion that required extensive maintenance and security costs. What Charles had done, essentially, was find the one mechanism that could move an immovable object. By making it clear that Andrew's intransigence would have consequences not for himself, but for his daughters, the king had identified the precise pressure point that would work. It wasn't about threatening Andrew with further humiliation or financial hardship. Andrew had already proven he could absorb that kind of punishment and still refuse to budge. But threatening the futures of Beatrice and Eugenie, even implicitly, even couched in the most diplomatic language imaginable, was something Andrew couldn't ignore. Some observers found the tactic distasteful, arguing that it was unfair to use innocent parties as leverage in what was essentially a real estate dispute. Others defended it as a necessary move by a monarch who had exhausted all other options. The truth probably lay somewhere in between. Charles was indeed protecting his nieces by ensuring their titles and positions remained secure, but he was also using their vulnerability as a tool to achieve a broader objective. It was cold, calculated, and entirely in keeping with centuries of royal politicking, where family relationships were always secondary to the needs of the institution. The frantic negotiations and heated arguments that took place in the days leading up to Andrew's capitulation were less about family drama and more about protecting the monarchy's future. Charles knew that every decision he made would be scrutinized, not just by the press and public, but by historians who would judge whether he had been an effective steward of the crown. Allowing Andrew to continue occupying Royal Lodge would have been seen as a weakness. Using his daughters as leverage, however uncomfortable, demonstrated that Charles was willing to make difficult choices to preserve the institution. While King Charles had successfully navigated the immediate crisis with Andrew, a darker cloud loomed on the horizon for Beatrice and Eugenie. The future of the monarchy didn't rest with Charles, who was already in his 70s when he ascended to the throne. The future belonged to Prince William, and William had very different ideas about what the royal family should look like. Ideas that, according to multiple sources and royal biographers, did not necessarily include his York cousins retaining their princely titles. Royal biographer and historian Andrew Loney painted a stark picture of what the monarchy might look like under King William V. William, he explained, would move towards a more European style of monarchy, one that resembled the streamlined royal families of Spain, Sweden, and the Netherlands. These continental monarchies had successfully trimmed their royal rosters, limiting titles and public funding to only the most senior working royals. Everyone else lived as private citizens, without the trappings and privileges that had traditionally come with royal blood. The European model wasn't just theoretical. King Felipe of Spain had already demonstrated how it could work in practice. Back in 2015, Felipe removed the title of princess from his sister Cristina, ahead of a trial in which she stood accused of tax fraud. Although Cristina was ultimately cleared of the charges while her husband was not, her title was never reinstated. It was a precedent that showed titles could be removed, that they weren't necessarily permanent fixtures, and that monarchs were willing to make tough decisions to protect the institution's reputation. William had reportedly taken note. According to sources close to the Prince of Wales, William's vision was rooted in practicality and a clear-eyed assessment of what the modern monarchy needed to survive. He was described as far more family-focused than previous generations, not working before 10 in the morning and stopping by 4 in the evening, taking very few trips abroad. His approach suggested he understood that the royal family couldn't be everywhere, couldn't open every supermarket, or attend every ribbon-cutting ceremony. The question became, if you couldn't do everything, what was the point of having numerous people carrying royal titles who weren't actively working for the crown? The plan, as outlined by multiple sources to various publications, was remarkably straightforward. William intended to issue letters patent early in his reign that would fundamentally reshape who could hold princely titles. Right now, those titles were protected by law, specifically by King George V's letters, patent of 1917, which established the rules for who automatically received the style of His or Her Royal Highness, Prince or Princess. William couldn't simply strip people of titles under the current framework, but as king, he could issue new letters patent that would supersede the old rules. Under William's proposed system, all non-working royals would lose their prince or princess titles. They would also be stripped of their His Royal Highness or Her Royal Highness honorifics. This wasn't just about Beatrice and Eugenie. The plan reportedly extended to Prince Harry, who, despite living in California and having stepped back from royal duties years earlier, still technically held his princely title. It would also affect Harry's children, Archie and Lilibet, who had been granted the titles of Prince and Princess when Charles became king, in accordance with the 1917 rules. Sources indicated that Harry and Meghan would additionally see their Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles removed entirely. Even William's own children weren't exempt from this new philosophy. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, currently styled as Princess and Prince, would have their titles essentially parked until they were old enough to decide whether they wanted to be working royals or pursue private careers. Only Prince George, as the direct heir to the throne, would be guaranteed to keep his royal styling throughout his life. It was a radical departure from centuries of tradition, but William apparently saw it as essential to creating a monarchy that could justify its existence to an increasingly skeptical public. The fewer titles in circulation, William's thinking went, the less chance there was for someone to embarrass the institution. Andrew's downfall had proven that royal titles could become liabilities when held by the wrong people. Every prince or princess represented a potential scandal, a potential Andrew situation waiting to happen. By limiting who could claim royal status, William would be limiting the monarchy's exposure to risk. But before any of this could happen, before William could implement his grand redesign, there was the current situation to navigate. And in the immediate aftermath of Andrew's title removal, rumors began swirling that William had already taken preliminary action against his cousins. Journalist Emily Maitlis, the same person who had conducted Andrew's catastrophic interview for the BBC, made explosive claims on her podcast about a meeting that had allegedly taken place. According to Maitlis, there had been a meeting earlier in the day before Andrew's announcement, a meeting between Prince William and Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie. In this meeting, William had allegedly delivered a blunt message to his cousins. They needed to get their father to move out of Royal Lodge, or the palace would start re-examining the state of their own titles. At the moment, they were allowed to be princesses, Maitlis reported, but pressure was being put on them. The implication was clear. If Andrew didn't cooperate, his daughters would pay the price. The story spread rapidly through media outlets. It painted William as ruthless, willing to use his family as pawns to achieve his objectives. Some royal watchers found it entirely believable, fitting with the image of William as someone who prioritized the institution above personal relationships. Others were skeptical, questioning whether William would really be that heavy-handed with cousins he was reportedly fond of. Palace sources quickly moved to deny the claims. A source speaking to a major tabloid called the story complete nonsense, insisting that anyone who knew William understood he wasn't that venomous and was actually fond of his cousins. Kensington Palace itself issued a response calling the claims inaccurate. They pointed out, quite correctly, that William didn't actually have the power to strip Beatrice and Eugenie of their princess titles. Under current law, that could only be done through an act of parliament. William could threaten all he wanted, but Without being king and without having issued new letters patent, he couldn't actually follow through. Yet the denial didn't entirely quell the speculation. Even if the specific meeting Mateless described hadn't happened, even if William hadn't personally sat down with Beatrice and Eugenie to deliver an ultimatum, the broader message was unmistakable. The sisters had to know that their futures were uncertain. They had to understand that when William eventually became king, their positions would be re-evaluated. Whether it happened through a direct confrontation or through indirect channels and media speculation, the pressure on them was real. Reports began emerging that Beatrice and Eugenie were furious about the situation. Sources claimed the princesses were privately trash-talking their cousin, upset that their titles had been used as bargaining chips in the Royal Lodge negotiations. One insider described their feelings as running sky-high emotionally, noting that while everyone was telling them how lucky they were that their titles had been protected, the fact that William had allegedly used those titles as leverage sat very badly with them. They couldn't help but fear, the source said, that this was only a temporary reprieve. The sisters were described as headstrong and defiant, their parents' daughters through and through. Despite the pressure, despite the implicit threats to their status, they were standing by their father. This loyalty, admirable in its way, only served to complicate their relationship with William further. From William's perspective, their continued close association with Andrew was problematic. Every photo of them together, every family gathering where they appeared alongside their father, reinforced the connection between the York sisters and the scandal that had nearly brought down the monarchy's reputation. Royal commentators noted that these bad feelings towards William, however justified the sisters might feel they were, would do them no good in the long run. William was going to be king, probably sooner rather than later given the realities of Charles's age. Alienating him now, when their futures depended on his goodwill, seemed strategically unwise. But emotions weren't always strategic, and Beatrice and Eugenie were living through an impossible situation. They loved their father despite his failings. They resented being used as tools in palace negotiations, and they were terrified about what the future might hold. The Sunday Times reported that William intended to exclude Andrew not just from public royal events but from private family gatherings as well, potentially including William's own coronation when it eventually took place. If Andrew wasn't welcome at these events, what did that mean for his daughters? Would they be forced to choose between attending major royal occasions and maintaining their relationship with their father? It was the kind of impossible choice that highlighted just how precarious their position had become. What made this all more painful for Beatrice and Eugenie was that they had done nothing wrong. They hadn't befriended Jeffrey Epstein. They hadn't given disastrous interviews. They hadn't brought scandal upon the family. Yet here they were, their entire futures hanging in the balance, subject to the whims of palace politics and the competing visions of what the monarchy should be. In the immediate aftermath of the Andrew crisis, Beatrice and Eugenie found themselves in a strange new reality. Their father had been stripped of everything that made him royal in the eyes of the world. He was no longer Prince Andrew, Duke of York. He was simply Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, a private citizen with a famous last name and a thoroughly destroyed reputation. Their mother, Sarah Ferguson, had also lost her Duchess of York title, the one remnant of her former marriage that she had clung to for nearly 3 decades. Yet somehow, against all odds and despite all the speculation, Beatrice and Eugenie remained princesses. The legal framework that protected them was straightforward, if archaic. King George V's letters patent of 1917 stipulated that the children of the sons of a sovereign automatically held the title and style of his or her Royal Highness Prince or Princess. As granddaughters of Queen Elizabeth II through the male line, Beatrice and Eugenie's titles were essentially hardwired into the system. Changing that would require either an Act of Parliament or new letters patent issued by a reigning monarch, neither of which had happened. For now, their status was secure, at least on paper, but security on paper didn't necessarily translate to security in practice. Both sisters understood that their positions within the royal family were more precarious than they had ever been. The question wasn't really whether they would keep their titles in the short term. The question was what role, if any, they would play in the modern monarchy, and whether those titles would still be theirs when Prince William eventually took the throne. In what appeared to be a deliberate effort to demonstrate their value to the institution, both Beatrice and Eugenie threw themselves into their charitable work with renewed vigor. Within days of returning to the United Kingdom after quietly leaving the country during the worst of the scandal, both women were photographed at various engagements. Eugenie had been in Paris on what was described as a girls' trip, while Beatrice had attended a tech summit in Riyadh with her firm. Their brief absences during the height of their father's humiliation seemed understandable. What else were they supposed to do while their parents were being so publicly eviscerated in the press? But they didn't stay away for long. Eugenie attended an event for the King's Foundation, spending time as a mentor with young people as part of the 35 Under 35 program. It was her first royal duty since her father had been stripped of his titles, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Here was a young woman showing up, doing the work, demonstrating that she could contribute meaningfully to causes that mattered to her uncle, the king. Beatrice, meanwhile, had back-to-back outings for Borne, a charity focused on maternal and neonatal health, of which she was patron. 1 week after Andrew's titles were formally removed, the two sisters were photographed sharing a warm embrace on a street in London's Mayfair district. The image, captured by paparazzi and splashed across tabloids, showed two young women supporting each other through an unimaginably difficult time. 2 days before that, Eugenie had been spotted out with her husband, Jack Brooksbank, in West London, actually appearing to laugh as they walked with friends. To outsiders, it might have seemed callous, this ability to smile and carry on while their father's world crumbled. But what else were they supposed to do? Life continued, children needed to be cared for, work obligations needed to be met. Royal editor Emily Nash, speaking on a podcast about the situation, emphasized that both King Charles and Prince William had made it clear that Beatrice and Eugenie would not be punished for things beyond their control. The sisters had the backing of their uncle and cousin, she explained, and they deserved public sympathy while facing scrutiny over their parents' actions and decisions. It was compassion coming from the top, recognition that these women were victims of circumstance rather than architects of their own misfortune. Yet compassion didn't necessarily translate into long-term security. The monarchy that King Charles envisioned, and more importantly, the monarchy that Prince William was planning, had increasingly little room for part-time royals, or those who occupied the grey zone between working and non-working status. Beatrice and Eugenie were the epitome of that grey zone. They attended major royal events, they held patronages, and did charitable work. They represented the family at various functions, but they received no money from the sovereign grant. They had to earn their own living through private employment. They were simultaneously inside and outside the institution, and that ambiguity made them vulnerable. The slimmed-down monarchy that Charles had championed for years was proving to be, in the words of one royal source, positively skeletal. He was heavily reliant on Princess Anne and the Edinburghs, Prince Edward and Sophie, to carry out the hundreds of engagements that the royal family was expected to fulfill each year. With Prince Harry and Meghan gone, with Princess Catherine dealing with her own health challenges, with Charles himself facing a reduced schedule, the workload on the remaining senior royals had become unsustainable. There had been discussions, multiple sources confirmed, about bringing Beatrice and Eugenie off the bench more regularly. The idea was to make them part-time, working royals, available for garden parties, state visits, Trooping the Colour, Royal Ascot, and other major events in the royal calendar. It would be a way to add some younger blood to an aging roster, to provide some glamour that had been missing, and to ease the burden on William and Catherine in particular. One palace insider described it as increasing their responsibilities as opposed to making them full-time working royals, a compromise position that would give the family more flexibility. But that plan, if it ever truly existed in any formal sense, ran headlong into the reality of who their father was and what he represented. Royal expert Richard Fitzwilliams suggested that the situation would have been completely different if Andrew had not been in disgrace. In a world where Andrew was still a respected member of the family, where the Epstein scandal had never happened, Beatrice and Eugenie could have seamlessly transitioned into working royal roles. But in the actual world they inhabited, bringing them forward risked reminding everyone of scandals the palace desperately wanted to forget. The contradiction was maddening. The monarchy needed more working royals to function effectively, yet the only available candidates were tainted by association with the institution's biggest modern scandal. It was a catch-22 with no obvious solution. Use Beatrice and Eugenie and risk negative publicity. Don't use them and watch the remaining senior royals collapse under an impossible workload. Charles and William were trapped between practical necessity and public relations catastrophe. Adding to the complexity was growing pressure from some quarters that Beatrice and Eugenie should make a public statement about their father's association with Jeffrey Epstein. Royal advisors had reportedly discussed whether the sisters should issue a formal statement acknowledging the victims of Epstein's crimes and distancing themselves from the scandal. The logic was straightforward. Neither princess had been accused of any wrongdoing. Both had been young adults when their father's friendship with Epstein became widely known. They had built independent careers and supported charitable causes while maintaining close family ties. But their continued public appearances with Andrew, particularly at family events, had reignited criticism that their silence might appear complicit, even if unintentionally so. A carefully worded statement acknowledging the suffering of Epstein's victims while reaffirming that they had no involvement was seen by some experts as the best way to balance compassion with familial loyalty. It would demonstrate awareness of the seriousness of the situation without throwing their father completely under the bus. But such a statement would also represent a profound breach within the family, a daughter publicly distancing herself from her parents in a way that would be devastating to Andrew and potentially unforgivable from his perspective. So far, neither Beatrice nor Eugenie had issued any such statement. They had remained silent, continuing to support their father privately while trying to build their own public identities through charitable work. It was an impossible tightrope walk, and one that left them open to criticism from all sides. Those who wanted them to denounce their father saw their silence as enabling. Those who valued family loyalty saw any suggestion that they should speak out as a betrayal of basic human decency toward a parent. Royal commentators noted that the sisters were in an impossible situation, a phrase that kept appearing in coverage of their predicament. They couldn't win. Speaking out would alienate their father and likely other family members who valued discretion and loyalty above all else. Remaining silent would continue to fuel speculation that they condoned or minimized the serious allegations that had been made. Meanwhile, their futures remained entirely dependent on decisions being made by others, by King Charles in the short term and by Prince William in the long term. The increased visibility they had received since Andrew's title removal, the new patronages and the higher profile engagements represented a middle ground that was emerging. Under Charles, they were being cautiously brought back into the fold, given opportunities to prove their worth without being made full working royals. It suggested that the king saw value in having them available, that he genuinely did feel responsible for them, and wanted to provide some pathway forward. But everyone understood that this arrangement was temporary and contingent. When William became king, everything would change. His vision of a European-style monarchy, his plans to remove titles from non-working royals, his apparent frustration with the messiness that extended family members brought to the institution, all of it pointed toward a future where Beatrice and Eugenie might find themselves on the outside looking in. They would likely retain their places in the line of succession, those being even harder to change than titles. But whether they would still be called princess, whether they would still be welcome at major royal events, whether they would have any role at all beyond being distant relatives of the monarch, remained very much an open question. For now, they were navigating day by day, appearance by appearance, trying to build goodwill and demonstrate value, while the ground shifted beneath their feet. They were standing by their parents, utterly mortified by the situation but unwilling to abandon their family. They were fulfilling their charitable obligations, showing up and doing the work even when it would have been easier to retreat entirely from public life. And they were waiting, like everyone else, to see what the future would bring when the crown eventually passed to their cousin William, a man who reportedly had very different ideas about who deserved to be called a prince or princess in modern Britain.